Morning from Amsterdam and TBLI Radical Truth Podcast. I'm thrilled today to have Angus Hervey, who's the founder and CEO, I think, of Fix the News, which he will tell you all about it, that he's doing, which is not only fixing the news, but ultimately trying to restore the social and environmental balance. Angus, thank you so much for taking the time. I know it's late in Australia, but for those who are not familiar, I was quite impressed with how many readers you have for your for your subscription base. For those that are not familiar with Angus Hervey and Fix the News, tell us, what is your big purpose? What are you trying to achieve with fixing the news? Because you take a rather unusual approach from traditional newsletters. And basically, where did this start? Where is it coming from? How did you get started? I'd like to really go deep into who is Angus Hervey and Fix the News. So thank you again for taking the time to do this.
No problem. Thanks for having me on the podcast. That's a lot of questions. I'm not quite sure where to start. Uh, I'll start with Fix the News. Fix the News is the one of the world's leading solutions journalism platforms. We are the largest solutions journalism newsletter on Substack, and we have over 70,000 readers around the world from 195 different countries. And
Wow.
we have been going in one form or the other for almost a decade. And people follow us and come to us to discover hidden stories of progress, uh, to read all of the A's and B's in the report card in humanity's report card that, for various systemic reasons, don't get shown in media and are largely rendered invisible by the information systems that we have developed as a species. And so each week we report 40 to 50 genuine stories of progress, ranging from stories of progress in global health, rising living standards, big conservation wins, progress in clean energy, human rights victories. And we really canvass those from around the world. And our readers love it. I love doing it. Um, it is an unusual approach, as you said, because we are deliberately unbalanced. But our philosophy is that regular media is so horribly unbalanced in the way that it concentrates on stories of death, disaster, and division, that we are trying to bring back some kind of balance by reporting only on stories of progress. And one last thing to add is we aren't really good news people. Good
Hmm.
news has kind of got a bit of a good news for most people is generally thought about as kind of fluffy stories. So, heartwarming tales of a rabbit and a squirrel, or a grandmother getting visited by her local neighborhood kids and helped out somewhere, or a dog on a surfboard. Those aren't the kind of stories that we report. We report large scale, genuine stories of progress where you're looking at the lives of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people being impacted, or huge conservation wins, or big scientific and technological breakthroughs that advance humanity forward in the spirit of humanism.
And I mean, most of the news lately is not really very uplifting or inspiring, particularly if your source is the mainstream media, Fox News or whatever. So how
Mm.
do you find all of these? Because it's not really even a processing of press releases. It's much more of an analysis and almost like an opinion piece on each one.
Mm.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, we do sometimes editorialize, and that's my job. I've been doing this work for over a decade, and so in the course of that decade, I've witnessed a very different story to the one that most people think has happened to humanity over the last 10 years. Um, and the reason that I've done that is, while I've been watching all the terrible things that have been happening, and we're all very well aware of those. Rising temperatures, the rise of populism, especially in the West, the retreat of democracy, wars in places like Ukraine and Gaza and Sudan, the collapse of the international rules-based order, continued environmental degradation and ecosystem collapse. We know these stories, that we are intimately familiar with their lurid details, because these stories are at the top of our news feeds, and they are on the front pages of every newspaper, if you still read a newspaper. They are very much the dominant stories in our psyche. And there is a very good reason for that, because those are the stories that sell. And what I've come to realize over the course of a decade of doing this work is that the news is not the report. The news is a very specialized form of storytelling that specializes in stories of death, disaster, and division. And it is excellent at telling those stories. It can tell those stories in a way that instantly captures our attention. And the reason that the news has become even more specialized in that form of storytelling is because we live now in an attention economy. And that over the course of the last 20 to 25 years, the business model of news organizations has been obliterated by the rise of the internet, and then the rise of social media. And now we are seeing it destroy an even greater threat in the form of artificial intelligence. And so what's happened is, as their audience has shrunk, those news organizations have had to fight for an increasingly smaller share of the market. And the way that they do that is by selling more negative news. And so if it bleeds, it leads is no longer a kind of colloquialism for cutthroat tabloid editors. It is now a potent evolutionary truth that lies at the heart of the entire media business. And so the argument that we make at Fix the News is that the biggest filter bubble in the world today is not the left versus the right, or progressive versus conservative, or globalists versus, the populists. The biggest filter bubble that everyone is stuck in is the bad news bubble. And that it is very, very difficult to break out of it. But that if you care to look, and that you know where to look, there are really extraordinary stories of progress happening all around us. And those stories exist side by side with all of the stories of collapse.
And so this is a weekly, it's a daily?
Yeah, this is a weekly newsletter. And the way we do the research, over the course of a decade, we've managed to cultivate a lot of different sources from around the internet, and also personal sources. We get a lot of our news from international organizations. So, the World Health Organization, the United Nations, the World Bank. Those are very rich sources of news for us. Also, a lot of publications that aren't English speaking. So we'll often dig up news from Eastern Europe, or from India, or from Colombia, or Southeast Asia. Something I always like to say is that Latin America has got something like 300 or 400 million people in it. When was the last time you heard a story out of Latin America that wasn't about drugs or forests?
Yeah.
And the answer for most people is not for years. But it turns out that there are a whole host of incredible stories happening in Latin America. The same is true in Asia. And then the other the place where increasingly we're starting to see really amazing progress, and this is in the field I think that you're interested in, on both conservation and on energy and sustainability, is from China. And I'd have to say, if I had to point to one of the 2 or 3 biggest changes I've seen in the last decade, it's that this rise of China's new energy ecosystem, but also Xi Jinping's directive of an ecological civilization. We're starting to see some truly incredible conservation success stories out of China as well.
And who is your audience? I mean, is it just broad-based professionals, advisors, plumbers, teachers, students, academia? Who is reading this?
So we have a pretty interesting cross-section of people. I'll try and describe it. In terms of our geographical spread, we're probably about 40% the United States, maybe 20% Australia. We have about 10% in the United Kingdom, and then a kind of similar share of 10% across places like Canada and New Zealand. So lots of English-speaking places. And then we have a big chunk of readers from Europe. I think we're very popular in the Netherlands. We also have a big readership in Germany. And then probably about 10 to 15% of our audience comes from non-English speaking countries. Russia, Eastern Europe, Latin America. So we really have a broad cross-section, across many, many different countries. In terms of the actual identity of the readers, it's quite a mix. We do have a lot of financial professionals that follow us, business people who follow us because they're trying to discern the signal amongst the noise, and we provide a signal that very few other people are providing. We have a lot of educators, a lot of teachers, a lot of people at tertiary institutions. We have a lot of teachers who use us in secondary schools, and a few in primary schools as well, who will each week they'll bring their students 4 or 5 stories of progress from around the world. Sea turtles have been taken off the endangered list. Tiger numbers are rising. China's emissions are falling now because clean energy is advancing so rapidly. Electric school buses in the United States. I don't know. They'll choose 4 or 5 stories that they want to bring to their students as a way of breaking their students out the doom loop, which they say is particularly important for young people. And then we have what we call our kind of purple hair brigade. For some reason, we're very popular in places like Florida, amongst retirement communities. I'm not quite sure why, but we have lots of old ladies named Mavis and Betty who follow us and who love us. And the only reason I can think of is that perhaps they want to convince themselves they're not leaving the next generation a hellscape on Earth. So it's a broad range of different people, and different people read us for different reasons.
Well, I would imagine that the elderly want the world to be a little bit better for their children and grandchildren. So maybe that's a reason. Are you hopeful? Because at the same time that there's some exciting things happening, maybe a Muslim democratic socialist will be mayor of the biggest city in the United States and the wealthiest city in the world with the most billionaires, who focus on affordability and tax the rich. So maybe things are improving, but at the same time, we see, Trump and others just destroying every single thing that was built up that seemed to be going in the right direction. Um, and you have children, or at least you mentioned that you had some children that you put down to sleep, so you're able to do this podcast. Are you hopeful or hopeless?
Look, I think like I mentioned earlier this idea of the report card, and I think what's happening at the moment is that we, as a result of media, we are only reading the F's and the E's on the report card of humanity. And as you know, if you have a child at school and you are, and that child brings home a report each term from school, and you're only pointing at the failures and at the places where that child has gone wrong, and are only talking about those problems, then eventually what happens, which is the child eventually comes to believe that they are bad and useless and there is no hope for their future. But what's happening is that we're not talking about the A's and B's on the report card of humanity. And it's a mix. And so there are many things going wrong in the world. We've already spoken about them. And as I've said, we're very aware of those things. We're not as aware of the things that are going right in the world. And here I can point to incredible progress in global health, a huge rise in living standards, poverty declining, maternal mortality declining, child mortality declining. Primary education is almost universal worldwide. Youth literacy is rising. Air pollution is falling for the first time in centuries. Air pollution deaths are down by something like 21% in the last 13 years. We are slowly turning the ship on on energy. It hasn't happened fast enough, but we are seeing progress. On the story of clean energy, I think that story is a very different one to the one that most people think. The story there is that since the Paris Agreement entered into force in 2016, China has been responsible for around 90% of the world's emissions growth. So
Mm.
just think about that for a moment. If you strip China out of the equation, then global emissions would likely have already peaked or at least plateaued over the last decade. So all of the drama, the impassioned pleas and the backroom deals and the documentaries and the marches, it kind of worked. But while those battles were all raging, China exploded, pumping out hundreds of millions of tons of carbon each year. China added the equivalent of dropping another 5 Germanys onto the global emissions ledger. And the inconvenient truth is that nothing that Greta Thunberg said, or nothing that Vladimir Putin did, or none of the net zero agreements, or anything agreed to in Brussels and Washington really had any bearing on China's actions. The world's climate curve has kept on climbing because Beijing has decided to keep burning coal and building factories. So that is bad news. That is a big red F on the report card of humanity over the last decade. But that is now changing. And the good news is as big as the bad news, because in the background, China has also been building a system to replace fossil fuels, and that system is now starting to bite. China's emissions have been declining for about a year and a half because it has added so much clean energy. And it doesn't stop at China's borders. 4 out of 5 solar panels, 2/3 of electric cars, almost all the world's batteries are now made in China. And that scale has crashed global prices and pulled entire regions into the slipstream, which is now why we're now seeing solar take off in Africa, in Latin America, why BYD is sending electric cars there for under $20,000, or in Pakistan or Bangladesh, or Kenya and Brazil, where grids have been rewired in real time. So this is the structural change that we've all been waiting for, and it's all happening because of what's taking place in China. And so the rest of the world is kind of, everything else is largely commentary, to be honest. And I think that's important to keep in mind when you see a headline about wildfires or Trump's latest, flourish, or another European impasse on some agreement. The decisive shift is happening in China, and the rest of the world is being towed along behind. And that's the climate politics story. And that is a climate politics story of both a big red F and a glowing yellow A, which is the color of solar power. And everything else, I think, is an afterthought. And so that's just an example of the way that we think at Fix the News, and the way that we see the world.
Um, I agree in part, but I need to give some pushback on this craziness obsession of EV, who I hate. I hate
Hmm.
EVs. They are the worst invention out there. And I agree with you that China, I mean, I was just recently in China, in Xiamen, and I was shocked to see how beautiful, green, sustainable, human that city, a big city. I mean, it's not a small city, Xiamen. Um, just absolutely stunning. But the part, like there's been 70, 80 billion going into climate tech funds, none of which are actually impacting climate. They're mainly unicorn chasers. None of them publish their carbon drawdown. And they'll do IPOs and they'll get 10x, and that's fine. They'll give their investors a return, but they're not impacting climate. And particularly EVs, which have been sucking up all of this money going into that. Let's get real. Cars in general, whether they're EV or gasoline powered, travel on average worldwide about 40 kilometers a day. In the US, half the trips are less than 10 kilometers. That's a bicycle trip. That's a walking walk you can do. On top of that, the cars are parked 80 to 90% of the day. So we are digging up all of this shit, all of the mining, all of the bauxite, all of the lithium, all and rubber trees and all of that for a vehicle that's hardly used. Most people are driving in by themselves when public transport infrastructure or public transport, let's call it public transport on demand, like an Uber van that comes
Hmm.
picking you up, is a much, 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 much better use of resources. So yes, great. There's lots of EVs, but it's a terrible, terrible waste. So I know that you like to focus on the positive stuff. I think it's also important to give people a reality check. I remember a few years ago there was a awful event called Catapult Future Fest. Maybe you heard about it in Oslo. And they had all of these Gen Zs and millennials toasting and socializing and partying. And they asked me to speak how technology is going to fix everything. And I said, I don't believe in that, you know. So no, no, we want to have a discussion. So, you know, everyone was saying, oh, technology is going to fix everything. We're going to get 10x. And there's, you know, there's thinking that maybe 1 billion youth unemployment will be coming. And most of them are not going to learn how to do AI coding for jobs. And the two largest employers in the world hardly gets any money, which is small scale agriculture, which has 1.4 billion people working in it, and
Yeah.
hospitality. Um, so it was a, you know, like a cold shower wake up call. So I agree with you. The direction is clear. No one, not even Fox News, none of them are saying, how can we pollute more? How can we waste more? How can we use more material? So I agree the general direction, but at the same time, we can't, you know, write everything as a positive direction when we take look back on the analysis. Is this really helping, or is this just giving this false illusion? Sorry for this
No,
little
not
rant.
not not at all. I love your rant, and I don't think I disagree with you at all. What I'm arguing for is that if you want to understand what is happening in the world, you need to understand where progress is happening as well as where things are not
Right.
going well.
Yeah.
And right now, we only really understand where things are collapsing or where things are falling apart. To come back to this idea of electric vehicles, it really depends on where you're talking about. You know, I don't think that BYD is going to be a great solution in places like Rwanda or Zambia, and to a lesser extent, even in places like Brazil. But I do think that electric vehicles are a really important solution in a place like China. And right now, electric vehicles are already displacing over 1 million barrels of oil per day in China. And that's making a significant impact on transportation fuel demand in that country. And that ultimately has an effect on emissions, which is what we care about. And by 2030, China is going to be displacing about 2.5 million barrels of oil per day because of its the rise in electric vehicles. And that is a big chunk of demand out of international oil demand, and that matters. That is progress. Now, you could perhaps argue that maybe China should have invested more in urban transportation, or maybe, you know, it shouldn't have gone to electric vehicles. Maybe it should have explored more around, oh, I don't know, you know, decommissioning coal plants or whatever. But that is what is happening, and we don't get to really have much of an influence over what China is doing. I say all of this not to say that China is doing it correctly, nor am I saying that there aren't problems with electric vehicles or embodied emissions, or that perhaps we could have taken other approaches. The only reason that I include this analysis is to say, if we want to have a true understanding of what is happening in the world, then we need to look at what is happening rather than what we think should be happening. And I think that we can. I think that this kind of data-driven optimism, having a fuller picture, I think is really crucial, especially if you work in sustainability, in ESG, if you're someone who cares about the future of humanity, if you identify as a humanist. I think it's important to have stories of progress in our back pocket in order to keep us going, uh, and to let ourselves believe that a better future is possible.
Oh, I'm totally agreed with you. I mean, I see when we started 25, 30 years ago trying to change the financial sector so that it worked for all stakeholders by educating those asset owners and managers. Fortunately, there is no group more predictable in the financial sector. It's just a bunch of alpha males that are overpaid by a factor of four and jump off the cliff at the same time together. So the behavioral change was never really a challenge because of their predictability. Unfortunately, the system even though the mistake that most of the environmentalists, whether it's Greta Thunberg or others, made is they were shouting loudly in Mandarin to someone who spoke German. So they were
Yeah.
shouting in the wrong language. And if you tell people about, sustainability, conservation is about sacrifice. And that's the mistake. You should have said it's about resilience because that is something that the business community and investors understand. Oh, resilience, okay, make it stronger, etc. Sacrifice, I don't want to give up anything. So I agree that the direction is clear, but at the same time, I think we all need to shout our barbaric yawp because at the same time that China and India are just pushing personal transportation with cars. Hong Kong has one of the best public transport system, super cheap. Singapore also, Tokyo that works, and it's very inexpensive. Something that most could understand if the world would realize that they have to raise $2.3 trillion a year, the public transport systems of the world, and most of them are AA rated in public-private partnership, is just a much wiser move, and particularly when you're talking about resilience. So I agree with you that we are headed in the right direction with bumps in the road, but I think it's also important not only to say the good news, but to say the critical voice, the shout our barbaric yawp, as Whitman said, because otherwise people will become complacent. We every year when we did our conference, I always invited the ESG mafia, the ESG analysts, the rating agents to come on a panel to discuss the state of the art. And it was better than when we started. That was the O.J. Simpson method, which basically, if I don't have a video of you murdering your wife, you're innocent. So we would invite them,
Mm.
and they would always refuse. All of them always refused to be on the same panel. They didn't want comparability. So last year or the year before, we launched the first open source database of all the ESG methodologies and frameworks, 44 independent presentations, and 100% of all of the big ones all refused to participate. Carbon Disclosure Project, the Principal Responsible Investing, S&P, MSCI, EcoVadis, which raised $750 million for the vehicle. And it's become, it's basically ESG has evolved into something that, like a membership card to a fitness club. You're showing everybody you have it, but you never go. And that's also important to say because Bloomberg claiming 50 trillion going into ESG. If that was true, there would be no need for your fix the news.
Mm.
If 50 trillion was
Well,
really going, yeah. Sorry for
well,
interrupting.
no, no, well, maybe we're talking about two different things. Obviously, Fix the News is not an ESG focused organization, um, and certainly, Fix the News. We're not a financial organization either. We're not activists as well. We're a media organization, and we're a media organization that is specifically interested in a different form of storytelling. And as I've already said, the dominant form of storytelling in media is to concentrate on everything that is going wrong. And so
Right.
Fix the News is trying to fix news by talking about everything that is going right. So we are very aware of how unbalanced we are, and we don't try to hide that. That is very upfront in our storytelling. But what we are trying to do is to create agency where data can't. And the reason that we're doing that is because the human brain is wired for narrative, not for spreadsheets. And so environmental statistics or rising temperatures or declining emissions or hectares lost or gained, that stuff might all be accurate, but our theory is that stuff fails to move people to act. And so what we do is we try to report stories like the green turtles have been taken off the endangered list. And the reason that happened was because tens of thousands of activists spent 20, 30 years sounding the alarm, and slowly but surely they turned that ship around. And through a combination of really hard work and, legal activism and volunteers and people making it known and conserving areas, they've slowly created space for turtle populations to return. And we believe that you can trace a line of causation in those stories that audiences can follow, and then, crucially here, they can imagine extending those. So maybe from rangers clearing snares to communities gaining income from tourism, or to governments holding a fragile peace where populations can recover. And those grounded specific accounts, we think, act as cognitive carriers for facts, which gives them emotional traction and cultural relevance. And that counters the paralysis that we think is induced by the way that media works today. And it shows that human effort has a consequence and that collective action can yield tangible results. That kind of narrative framing then transforms information into agency. It gives our readers and our listeners something to join in rather than to just observe, and it converts awareness into participation. So that is why we do what we do.
And is Fix the News a for-profit, non-profit, or not for loss?
No, so we have a very interesting setup. We are 100% independent and reader funded. So a portion of our readers subscribe to the premium version of our newsletter. We have a freemium model. But then what we do is we give away 1/3 of all of our revenue to small charities or organizations around the world that are working to make the world a better place. And so we'll donate to women's shelters in Uganda. We've just donated to a chimpanzee sanctuary in Sierra Leone. Our next donation is going to Haiti, to an organization that is giving orphans, providing education to orphans. And the reason that we do that is we call it our circular news model, which is that our readers come to us to read stories of progress. We report on those stories of progress, and through that reporting, we sign up more readers. Those readers donate to us. We donate to small organizations that make progress happen, and then we get to report on that progress. And so it kind of becomes this virtuous circle. And for us, that's a really important part of what we do. We think it's important to make progress happen and not just to report on it.
And how do you, I mean, the world is big. There's a lot. Do you have like kind of reporters or partners all around the world that send you articles? I mean, how do you find these articles? Because a lot of them I was looking at are not really covered by many of the other sustainability platforms.
We pride ourselves on really finding stories that nobody else reports. There are a number of solutions journalism platforms, but we are pretty sure that we are the most comprehensive and that we get the most coverage. And I would love to tell you that there's a secret sauce, but it's just hard work. My friends like to tease me that I read the internet for a living, but really that is what I've been doing for a decade. I'm a former economist. I did my PhD at the London School of Economics, and I was in academia.
You attended the fraud factory.
I did. I'm a recovering academic. So I understand, for my sins, I understand how to hunt down and uncover reputable stories. And I know the difference between a reputable story and one that is, I don't like the word fake news, but one that is kind of on shaky ground. One of the important things for us is to make sure that all of our evidence is gold-plated and that we can really back the stories that we report. But over the course of a decade, I've just fortunately developed a very wide range of sources and websites that I can go to, certain accounts that I follow, certain organizations that I always go back to look at their latest news. And through that, we're able to get a pretty comprehensive picture of everything that's going right in the world.
And how do you stay? I mean, you're focused on the positive things, but you also have to sift through the shit and the garbage out there. So how do you stay upbeat?
My dirty secret is that I'm the original bad news junkie. Um, I, if I didn't, I'm patient zero of my newsletter. I created this newsletter because it's what I needed a decade ago. When I finished my PhD, I was doing research in Gorongosa National Park, which is in Mozambique. And when I first went there to try and look at deforestation, it was a park that was devoid of life. It's this incredible place. It's at the bottom of Africa's Rift Valley. And in the 1960s and 70s, they called it the Serengeti of the South.
Hmm.
This extraordinary alluvial plain, where at the bottom of the Rift Valley, an incredible abundance of animals and life. Visitors there said it must have been where Noah's Ark had landed. But then in the 1970s, civil war broke out in Mozambique, and that park became the headquarters for the rebels, the Renamo. And over the course of 15 to 20 years, they essentially ate out the entire park. So they killed all the elephants for ivory, they ate all the animals to sustain themselves. And in the 1990s and 2000s, when conservationists went back in there, it was essentially all large mammals in the park had disappeared. And when I was there, it was a spooky, very weird place. It was a place where it felt like the world had ended. And so when I finished doing that research and I came back and started doing research on climate change and sustainability, I was burnt out and just incredibly depressed. I'd kind of given up. I thought we didn't have a future. I'd kind of seen the worst sides of human nature, our propensity for cruelty to each other, and also our ability to destroy life. But I then came across a press release from the United Nations on the Millennium Development Goals one night, very late at 2 a.m. And I remember reading it and just being flabbergasted. All these incredible statistics: poverty declining, maternal deaths declining, child mortality declining, big conservation wins. And I remember sitting there thinking, why has none of this been reported in the news? Why have I been reading news for the last 2 or 3 years, and why have I never seen any of these stories? And so what I decided on that night, this was back in 2013, I decided I decided I was going to go on a detective hunt, and I was going to see if I could try and discover those stories, because I knew they must be happening. And really, that detective hunt now has lasted for over a decade. And what it's convinced me of is that many bad things are happening in the world and things are falling apart. But at the same time, there are tens of millions of people who are stitching the world back together,
Yeah.
and progress is happening out of sight and out of mind. But it's happening on a scale that I think more people should know about.
Yeah.
And that gives me a resilient form of hope for the future, not a naive optimism. I'm fully aware of all the things that are going wrong, but I'm lucky because my work also makes me fully aware of all the things that are going right, and I have a much more balanced view, I think, as a result.
Uh, Um, I agree with you. Unfortunately, the ones doing the most talk the least, and the ones doing the
Mm.
least talk the most. So people publish the press releases of bullshit and don't really dig. So I admire that you actually look for those jewels out there. How did you build up from zero, a kind of burnt out research guy who learned all kind of bad habits at the London School of Economics, to build up this organization of 65,000 subscribers?
Again, I wish I could tell you that there's secret sauce, but it's slow, steady, hard work. I do remember one of the biggest turning points for me came in 2015. 2015 really was the point at which I decided to start publishing a regular newsletter. So the email newsletter has been going in some form or the other for about a decade. But I read something, it was by an American author, a guy called Derek Sivers, and it's the simplest form of advice you could possibly get, but it's something that has stayed with me ever since, and has been proven out, which is that it's not what you know, it's what you do consistently that counts.
Yeah.
And you can have the best picture about the world and know all the best facts and have a particular view or a particular angle or understand something that nobody else understands. But if you don't show up regularly, week after week or day after day, sharing that with the world, then it doesn't matter.
No.
And so what you do is what you're known for, not what you know. And I remember reading that, and it was like a light bulb going off in my head. And I remember thinking, okay, if I am seeing all these stories of progress, I need to start sharing them. And that really was the genesis of the newsletter. It's been a slow, steady build over a decade of just steadily rising subscriber numbers. We've had a few fortunate breaks. I've spoken at TED a few times. We've had a
Good for
few
you.
articles kind of go semi-viral, but really, there's no secret sauce except if you want to do the thing, you got to do the thing.
You might find we did a podcast with a woman named Paula Caballero. You probably don't know her. She was the one that pushed the UN to get the SDGs,
Mm,
done. So you might find and the work that she had to do and the politics of trying to get everybody on board, you might find that interesting. It's on Spotify. So I agree with you that the work is really farming, not hunting, and it takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of effort to keep the focus. And my biggest
mm,
challenge was not convincing the financial sector, was convincing my wife that we're on the right path after these 25 years. Um, the you might because you're in Australia, there is one. I don't know if you know Barney Swan from Climate Force. You might want to
mm,
check him out. His father was the first to walk to the North and South Pole, and Barney is also a polar explorer. He's doing a quite a large nature-based solution to restoring a rainforest in
mm,
I think it's Queensland. You
mm.
might check him out. Climate Force in Australia. Good guy. Um, how can those that are listening to this help you apart from just subscribing? Because I guess you want to kind of scale that more people hear about the positive development and don't get sidetracked, like the curmudgeon that I am, of focusing on the things that are not
Yeah.
functioning.
Look, I think the first thing that your listeners should understand is that we are not more uniquely doomed than any other generation.
Mm,
Each generation thinks that they are the ones who are facing the end of the world, and each generation figures it out. I'm not saying that this is not a plea for naivety or me saying, look, we can all just sit back and relax and good things are going to happen. This is more just to say, you know, please understand in your heart of hearts that there are incredible things happening in the world. Global health, we've seen mortality rates globally go down by 13% in the last decade. Incredible progress on tuberculosis, malaria, AIDS, the world's deadliest infectious diseases, neglected tropical diseases. Something like 30% fewer people need treatment for those diseases anymore. We have amazing new medications for AIDS in the form of lenacapavir. We've got a malaria vaccine rolling out across the entire African continent. Malaria is a disease that kills 1,000 African children every day, and we finally have a vaccine for that. That is one of the biggest health stories in the world. Why are we not hearing about it in the newspapers? On climate, things are going badly. We are not we are not reversing that curve fast enough, but the direction of travel is the right one. And for the first time,
mm,
I think a few weeks ago, the International Energy Agency says that, it's now predicting a decline in emissions by the 2030s. I think it's going to happen sooner than that. So, there is twice as much money going into clean energy now as into fossil fuels. And despite everything that Trump is doing, clean energy is still being built out at a far quicker rate in the United States than dirty energy. On human rights, two countries in the last 2 months have banned child marriage. Bolivia and Colombia banned it at the end of last year. Bolivia and I'm sorry, I can't remember. But the two countries in Latin America. school meals. 480 million children now get fed at school around the world. That number is up from something like 250 million from before the pandemic. Cancer rates are going down. I could keep on reading off these statistics. Deforestation in the Amazon is down 11% compared to last year. Deforestation in the Amazon is down to its lowest rate since 2014. The policies of Lula are working, and it's not all plain sailing, but things are changing. So the first thing I would say to readers is just understand that there are some things that are going right. In the Netherlands, congratulations, you've just elected someone who isn't completely insane. And it turns out that that there are decent politicians out there, and that people can still listen to a good argument. So I think populism has probably reached its high watermark as well. The second thing that I would say is try and inoculate yourself against the fear virus. And so when bad news arrives at you, try not to pass it on. The problem with bad news is that it spreads so rapidly, and it can travel around the world in a matter of seconds. And so when those stories arrive at you, try not to discuss them at the water cooler, or talk to your children about them, or complain to your husband or your wife about the latest horrible thing that Trump has done, or the latest terrible thing that some fossil fuel executive has committed. We know those stories, they don't need to be spread. Instead, think of yourself as someone who has been vaccinated against the fear virus. And when those stories reach you, try not to pass them on. We need more people who are inoculated. And if we have a critical number of people who inoculate themselves against the fear virus, it doesn't get passed on. And then the last thing is sign up to the newsletter. Check it out. It's free. If you like it, you can subscribe to the premium version, but you don't have to. Fixthenews.com. It's easy to find. And when you get those stories in your inbox, if any of them resonate or you like them, then pass them on. Share them with the people you love. Share them with the people you work with. And try to be someone that starts spreading stories of progress as well. And slowly through that, I think that we can start building a movement of people that, tell the story of how humanity might overcome this very difficult and very challenging moment.
Thank you for that. Well, two things that I agree with you about, spreading the bad news rather than sharing the good news. Two things that you might not know about. A friend of mine, he's the largest organic rice producer in Southeast Asia. And he sent me a website that lists the cities or medium-sized cities with the worst air pollution. And I was surprised because there were two cities in Thailand that has very little industry. So I asked him, why are they such bad air pollution? He said,
Burning the rice
because of the
crops.
rice field burnings.
Yeah.
And he said, you know why the farmers burn the rice fields? I said, no, I don't know. Well, do they like fire? So he said, no, they're poor. And to take away the rice, that means they got to rent a tractor to, take away the biomass and the rice. So he came up with a really cool solution. He said to the farmers, I'll rent the tractor. I'll take away the biomass, give you the rice for free. So you've made money, you've saved money on that. And he developed a technology to convert all of that biomass to a paper and single-use plastic replacement. And in
Wow.
Thailand, they use food containers 50 million a day. 50
Yeah.
million a day. So I was, quite impressed with that.
What an amazing story.
It's
Amazing.
a very simple solution. And the other one is there's a Dutch company, which you probably would like, and they developed a solar panel that has 90% less CO2 emissions. And how did they do that? He said their solar panel doesn't use aluminum. It doesn't use PFAS. So you don't have to mine for bauxite and all of that. They use plastic pellets, pellets, put that in an extruder, which makes a very strong honeycomb backing. They put the solar cell on that, no PFAS, and they don't use glass. So they put a coating that protects that. So it's very light, but there's no all that mining and stuff is not necessary. So I agree with you. There are loads and loads and loads and loads of solutions, but they're often under the radar. What gets the attention is nonsense coming out about Saudi
Mm.
Arabia about how little renewable energy or fuel-free energy has impacted the energy mix and all of that. That always
Mm.
happens right around COP 30 or COP 20 or
Yeah.
whatever the COP is. Um,
You know, can I tell you what's happened? I'll tell you the secret to all of this. And it comes back to something I shared earlier with you, which is that I'm patient zero of my own work. What I've come to realize over a decade of doing this work is that optimism isn't a reaction to the world around you. It's a choice by which you can navigate the world.
right.
And when you make that choice, the world suddenly starts looking like a different place.
Yeah.
And you suddenly start seeing all the things that have been there all along, but just weren't visible because you had the blinders on. And that doesn't mean you don't see the other things too, but you have a better picture of what's out there. And when you make that choice, the world feels different as well. And I feel very, very differently about the future now than I did a decade ago. And last year, I went back to Gorongosa, and Gorongosa is one of now the great restoration stories on the African continent. There are 100,000 large mammals on the Gorongosa National Park. It is thriving. They developed this incredible model where they invest money from tourism in the communities surrounding the park. Tourism is up, the animals are back, they have the big five. It's a place that has returned. Nature has returned there. And so I've traveled the full circle as well, and realized that things can change and the world can be fixed and it can be restored.
I um I really appreciate your approach and your attitude. It just one thing that I find question is that how do you personally deal with when you see something, this is such crap getting all of the attention, and you're not going to put it on your newsletter because it's not really a positive news. You don't want to share the negative, but it did
Mm,
if you're researching everything, you're also seeing garbage.
mm, mm. I, I feel it. You know, the Israel and Gaza has been so devastating to watch the way that humanity has reacted to that war has been so disappointing. Likewise, what's happening in Sudan. You know, Sudan doesn't get a flotilla, unfortunately.
No.
But you know, what's happening there is equally as devastating, if not more. And the actions of some of the world's leaders, I cannot fathom the mindset of people that behave in that way. And so when I read those stories, I feel it. I have days where I really feel that despair and I feel that anger and I go there. But I'm also lucky because the next day I'll read a story about the incredible boom in battery storage around the world,
Mm,
and
mm.
and 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 then I'll read another story about um, the fact that the Czech Republic just banned corporal punishment. You know, that happened 3 days ago. Nobody's heard that story, or the
No.
fact that crime is down 30% in India, or that the United States is on track for its lowest murder rate in its history this year.
Yeah.
And then I read that story, and then I feel hope again, and I go, oh, okay, hold on. There's actually people out there who aren't completely insane. Or I read about a politician or a leader who's done something that moves the dial in the positive direction. And so it ultimately comes down to balance. And it's not about not feeling those things. It's not about not looking at them. It's about balancing them out.
Angus, you're a star. I really admire your ability to focus on the uplifting and try to compartmentalize things that are depressing or bringing down, because there is a lot. But so I admire that you do that. And for those of you who are watching, wondering what is this green light emanating from his chest,
Yeah.
it's basically there are some snipers making sure that he's
Yeah.
telling the true story. So Angus, thank you so much. I just need to um, thank several people who helped make this podcast. I'd like to thank our entire production crew for making this webinar possible. Ricky, my absolute better half with no filter. Xi Jinping, our head of transparency and integrity. Vladimir Putin, our head of conflict resolution, Jeff Bezos, our human resources and full tax compliance leader, Elon Musk, our humility coach, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, our Nobel Prize nominee for
Yeah, wow.
stupidity. Thank you
What a
all
cast.
very much. And Angus, thank you for doing this. Let me just stop this now.